The cold February air cut through the skin, seeping through the woolen fabrics of coats and uniforms. The sky over Arlington National Cemetery was frozen in grim grayness, as if the very space grieved along with those who had come to say goodbye. Tall, stern rows of headstones stretched into the distance, their whiteness stark against the black earth, barely dusted with the remnants of recent snowfall. Silence, deep, heavy, filled with the presence of death. The only sound was the muffled rustle of boots on wet earth as officers of the U.S. Army, in impeccably pressed uniforms with golden buttons, stood in line. Their faces were impassive, bronze and fair, young and wrinkled. They had seen death before, escorted friends, lost subordinates, but each time they came here, the pain echoed anew, like a wound that never fully heals. At the center of the morning gathering stood a widow, her fingers convulsively clutching a folded American flag. Melissa Danvers, in a black woolen coat with a veil hiding her tear-stained face, was hunched under the weight of loss. The man they were burying today, Major William Danvers, was not just a soldier. He was the father of her children, her husband, a man who had once promised to return alive, but could not keep that promise. The coffin, draped in the flag, stood before the honor guard. Next to it, towering above all, in impeccable dark blue uniform, stood General Jonathan Crawford. His posture was straight as a statue. His shoulders did not tremble, although he might have felt the same pain as the others. 4 silver stars on his epaulets spoke of his status, but today it did not matter. Today he was a friend of the deceased, a brother in arms. His face was hidden behind dark aviators, but even through the lenses one could feel his tension. A veteran of 3 wars, Crawford had passed through the jungles of Southeast Asia, the sands of the Middle East, the icy mountain ranges where even the best reconnaissance units dared not venture. He knew what death looked like, felt it in his breath countless times. But today was different. Today it was personal. When the bugler took the first note, the silence was finally broken. The mournful sounds of taps filled the air, penetrating the chests of those gathered, lingering in their lungs. They sounded like the final chord of life, like a farewell speech for those who would no longer hear words. The widow sobbed. One of the officers slightly tilted his head, pressing his fist to his chest. A young lieutenant with reddish hair quickly blinked, driving away unwanted tears. Then came the 21-gun salute. The shots echoed through the cemetery, causing birds hiding in the branches of bare trees to take to the air. Crawford took a deep breath. The final salute had sounded, and now all that remained was to say goodbye. He was already preparing to step forward to pay his respects when a sharp, commanding voice rang out, "Get down! Hands up where I can see them!" Like thunder, this voice shattered the silence, striking the crowd like a whip. Several people involuntarily turned to the source of the noise. At the edge of the ceremony among the graves stood 2 policemen. One of them, young, with a tense face, nervously put his hand on his holster. But the one who spoke, a burly, middle-aged man with a stern face, a harsh squint, and pursed lips, already held a weapon in his hands. Sergeant Roy Blaine. He was looking straight at General Jonathan Crawford, his finger resting on the trigger. A deathly silence fell. The general did not move. "Get down now!" Blaine barked again, his voice like a shard of glass piercing eardrums. Crawford did not move. He only slightly raised his head, as if analyzing the situation, his face still hidden behind glasses, concealing emotions. But the soldiers around him had already begun exchanging astonished glances. What the hell is going on? The widow Melissa Danvers gasped for breath. The lieutenant, standing closest, instinctively reached for his belt but stopped, realizing he was unarmed. After all, he was at a funeral. Blaine looked only at Crawford. "Don't you hear me, sir?" There was emphasized contempt in his voice, and then, for the first time, Crawford spoke. His voice was cold as a blade. "What do you think you're doing?" Blaine twitched slightly, as if he did not expect the general to speak in such a tone. He was prepared for resistance, for fear, but not for calm. "I said, hands up!" Blaine shouted, his voice sharper, his finger twitching on the trigger. It was dangerous. The young officer next to him, Oliver Stanton, looked confused. He clearly did not understand how they ended up in such a situation. His lips parted as if he was about to say something, but he did not have time. "Sergeant, maybe we should—" "Shut up, Oliver," Blaine barked, not even looking at his partner. Crawford quietly sighed as if realizing the full extent of what was happening. He was not surprised. Blaine looked at him as if Crawford was not a general, as if he was not a person, as if he was a threat. And that was all Crawford needed to know. Crawford realized this man did not see a four-star general of the U.S. Army before him. He saw a black man in a cemetery, and that was enough for him. Something inside General Crawford slowly but inevitably tightened, and he realized that from now on, this day would not just be the funeral of his friend. It would be the beginning of the fall of Sergeant Roy Blaine. Silence, thick, almost tangible, as if the very earth held its breath, respecting the soldier's final journey. All eyes were fixed on the flag-draped coffin, on the widow whose hands trembled, clutching the triangular folded cloth. The air smelled of damp earth, gunshots from the honor guard, and a faint hint of the fading winter. And suddenly, a voice, harsh, ragged, out of place here. "Hands up! Get down! Quick!" The sound was so sharp that people at first did not even realize its meaning. It did not belong to any of the military. It was not part of the ceremony. It disrupted this ceremony. Heads turned sharply toward the source of the noise. Glances became anxious, hands tensed. At the edge of the cemetery path stood two policemen. They were in uniform. Standard dark blue, badges, holsters. But one thing set them apart from the rest. They were armed. One of them, tall, broad-shouldered, slightly stooped, but with a face like a granite boulder. Sergeant Roy Blaine. White skin, square jaw, cold gray eyes. In his hands, a Glock 17 gleamed, aimed straight at General Crawford. Next to him, slightly behind, stood the second, Oliver Stanton. Young, about 25, with fine features, light, almost childlike eyes, which were now wide with tension. His right hand was on the grip of his pistol, but he had not yet fully drawn it. "I said, hands up!" Blaine barked. He took a step forward, firmly, confidently, like a man who knows he is in charge. But Crawford did not move. His hands remained lowered, his face hidden behind dark glasses. The crowd around froze as if time had slowed down. "Get down now!" Blaine's voice was like the crack of a whip. Soldiers exchanged glances, not believing their eyes. What's going on? Crawford had done nothing, but a gun was already pointed at him. Stanton nervously swallowed, his hand still on his holster. His movements were indecisive, unlike Blaine, who held himself as if this were all part of his usual routine. People did not know what to do. Someone instinctively pressed a hand to their mouth. Melissa Danvers, the widow, sharply inhaled, clutching the folded flag to her chest, as if it could protect her from what was happening. Lieutenant Rodriguez, a young officer with Latin American roots, made an almost imperceptible movement with his hand to his side, instinctively trying to check his weapon. But it was not there. They were all unarmed at the funeral. A woman in civilian clothes, the elderly mother of one of the soldiers, clutched her chest, her face paled, and Crawford stood motionless. Military men looked at him, at the man who commanded the army, the man under whose command many of them had fought. But now he was just a black man under gunpoint, and this fact froze everyone. The situation was heating up. "This is the last time I'm repeating," Blaine growled, his face flushed, his hand twitched. And then there was a sound. Click. The hammer fell into the void. It was a frightening sound because it meant the intention to shoot. No shot followed. The gun was not loaded. This sound made even Stanton flinch. Crawford did not flinch. His face remained calm, almost eerily unperturbed. Blaine was the first to realize the mistake. His fingers quickly moved to the magazine. He was going to reload the weapon. But this click had already shattered the silence, and now everything had changed. Time froze. A cold wind rustled through the cemetery, stirring the folds of the flag covering the coffin. The faint crunch of wet grass under Blaine's boots was the only sound breaking the deafening silence. Jonathan Crawford did not move. His posture remained straight, shoulders squared, chin slightly raised. He did not take a step back, did not raise his hands, showed no fear or concern. His face was hidden behind dark glasses, but even without them it was clear. He was looking straight at Blaine, and in that gaze there was neither pleading nor fear. Only expectation, as if he knew this moment would come, as if he had already been in this situation, only not here, not now, not in this country, but there, somewhere far away, on another land where weapons were also pointed at him. But there was one difference. There, it was the enemy. Now, it was the one who should have protected. Blaine held the pistol aimed at Crawford. His breathing was steady, his expression stern, but in the corners of his eyes a spark of irritation flickered. He did not like that Crawford was not obeying. He was waiting for a reaction, waiting for fear, waiting for the general to raise his hands or at least flinch. But this was not happening, and this began to anger Blaine. "I won't repeat it twice," he said. "Get down." His voice sounded harsh, as if giving an order to a junior officer. Crawford did not move. The tension became unbearable. The crowd around them froze in shock. People stood like statues, barely breathing. Officers, sergeants, young soldiers, veterans, mothers of the fallen, all realized what had just happened. They were witnesses. Some of them had fought side by side with Crawford. Others simply knew about him, heard stories, read about him in military reports. The man before whom Sergeant Blaine stood was a four-star general of the U.S. Army, a war hero, a living legend, and he had a gun pointed at him by a man who did not even understand whom he was holding at gunpoint. And at that moment, among those present, a realization began to grow. Whispers, clenched fists. Someone slowly, almost imperceptibly, shook their head in disbelief. How is this possible? How can this even be allowed? Why does this man think he has the right to demand anything from a general? Why is he holding him at gunpoint like a criminal? No one moved, but the tension was mounting, ready to explode in a storm. Lieutenant Rodriguez slowly clenched his jaw. He could feel something boiling inside him. Sergeant Harris, a burly man with dark skin, gritted his teeth so hard his cheekbones tensed. They could not believe what they were seeing. And most of all, they were struck not by the incident itself, but by Crawford's composure. He did not blink. He did not utter a word. He did not twitch a single muscle. And Blaine, he did not understand. Stanton took a nervous step back. He was at a loss. He did not know how to handle the situation because this was not part of the training scenarios. He had been told that threats must be suppressed quickly, that if someone does not obey, it means they are dangerous. But this was a general. Why should he have been afraid? Stanton did not know how to act in a situation where the person at gunpoint simply stands, simply waits. He glanced at Blaine out of the corner of his eye. The sergeant held the pistol firmly, confidently. His hand did not tremble, but there was irritation in his eyes. He was waiting for obedience, but he was not getting it, and this angered him. He did not see the general. He did not see the legend. He did not see the man who had dedicated his life to defending this country. He saw skin color. That was all that mattered to him. And this thought finally dawned on Stanton. Something inside him wavered. He realized. He understood that they had done something irreversible. But Blaine did not understand. He thought he had everything under control. He did not see the situation from the outside. He was sure his power was absolute, and that this power allowed him to do whatever he thought necessary. He did not see that he had already lost. He did not see the approaching moment when his world would collapse. But Crawford saw, and he waited, because every word spoken from now on would determine Blaine's fate. General Jonathan Crawford still did not move. His face remained impassive, even though a gun was pointed at him. Sergeant Roy Blaine gripped the pistol tighter, his fingers turning white. He did not understand why the general was not obeying. "Last time I'm asking," Blaine growled. "Get down." Crawford slowly removed his glasses and folded them into his uniform pocket. His dark eyes met Blaine's. "Why?" he asked calmly. Blaine was momentarily taken aback. He had not expected a question. He had expected resistance, shouting, fear, but not a question. "What?" he muttered. "You're asking me to get down. Why?" Crawford spoke without the slightest hint of agitation. His voice was low, steady, honed by years of command. Blaine blinked. He looked at Stanton as if seeking confirmation of his righteousness. "You broke the law," he said. Crawford tilted his head slightly. "Which one?" Blaine clenched his jaw. "You trespassed on federal cemetery grounds without permission." Crawford's face remained expressionless. "I am a general in the U.S. Army." Blaine tensed. "And," he spat out, "I have the right to be here." Blaine opened his mouth, but no words came out. He knew Crawford was right. "You're creating a threat," he tried to justify himself. Crawford slowly sighed. "A threat?" He took a step forward. The pistol in Blaine's hands trembled. "How exactly am I threatening you, Sergeant?" Blaine felt his blood boil. This man standing before him was too confident, too calm. It was infuriating. He should have been afraid. He should have obeyed, but he did not. And now Blaine was angry. "You—" His voice faltered. He took a breath. "You're not in the Army now. This isn't a battlefield. Here, I make the rules." "Are you sure?" Crawford took another step forward. Blaine involuntarily stepped back half a step, and only then realized it. He gritted his teeth. "I'm not retreating." He raised the pistol even higher, almost touching Crawford's chest with it. "Back off!" But the general did not move. The crowd behind them began to stir. Whispers, short, hushed, but growing louder and louder. "Has he completely lost his mind? This is General Crawford. This cop has no idea what he's doing." Some in the ranks began to move, almost imperceptibly edging closer to Crawford. Officer Rodriguez clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white as his nails dug into his skin. Sergeant Harris exhaled softly. This bastard just signed his own death warrant. Stanton felt a chill run down his spine. He realized this was a mistake, and he was part of it. He looked at the crowd and saw faces, officers, soldiers, veterans. Their eyes said more than any word. They would not stand by if Blaine crossed the line. Stanton took a nervous step back. "Sergeant, maybe that's enough?" Blaine did not even look at him. "Shut up, Oliver," Stanton gasped. He did not want this. He did not sign up for this. And now they were seconds away from a catastrophe. But Blaine did not see the whole picture. He saw only his own righteousness, his own power. "You!" He turned back to Crawford. "I order you to get down or I will open fire." Crawford slowly tilted his head to the side, as if evaluating him. "Are you really going to do that, Sergeant?" Blaine clenched his jaw. "Don't test me," Crawford exhaled, barely shaking his head. "You don't even realize what you've just done." At that moment, a voice sounded behind them. "Sergeant Blaine, lower your weapon." It was a woman's voice, cold, firm. Blaine turned around. Colonel Catherine Bailey was approaching him. Tall, stately woman with snow-white hair. Her face was like stone. She looked straight at him. "Sergeant," she repeated, "do you know who you're pointing your gun at?" The crowd finally erupted in murmurs. Whispers turned into words. "This idiot has no idea. He pointed a gun at the damn general. He's finished." And at that moment, Blaine realized, he saw the stars on Crawford's epaulets. 4 stars. And his face changed, because he understood that he had just destroyed himself. But Crawford did not retreat. He stood staring intently into Blaine's eyes, and he said only one word. "Wrong answer." And at that moment, Blaine's world began to crumble. Sergeant Roy Blaine felt his mouth go dry. The crowd behind him was already murmuring louder, but he heard only a faint ringing in his ears. He realized, but he could not accept it. He looked at General Crawford, at his impassive face, at his stern posture, at the 4 silver stars on his epaulets. The general did not even blink. He just waited. He waited for the moment when Blaine would fully realize the pit he had dug for himself. Blaine swallowed, but the pistol was still raised. He could not lower it. That would mean admitting a mistake. And he did not make mistakes. Or did he? But then why did he feel a tightening in his chest from fear? "Sergeant Blaine," Colonel Catherine Bailey repeated, "lower your weapon." Her voice was sharp as steel, and now the entire crowd was frozen in anticipation. Soldiers looked only at him. Some averted their eyes. Others looked straight, expressionless. But no one supported him. No one was going to cover his back. He felt truly cold. He looked at Crawford again. The general did not look angry. He just looked at him, as if studying him, as if knowing in advance how this would end. He understood Blaine better than Blaine understood himself. "You don't know who I am, but I know you." Those words were not spoken aloud, but Blaine heard them. He felt them with every fiber of his being. He began, but his voice faltered. "I can't lose." But he had already lost. He felt it in the way Stanton took a cautious step back, distancing himself from him. He saw it in the eyes of the soldiers, in Bailey's expression, in Crawford's icy calm. He had already lost, but there was only one way out. He had to stand to the end, or fall forever. "Sergeant," Bailey's voice became ice cold. "Did you hear the order?" Blaine flinched. His lips parted, but words stuck in his throat. Because there was no justification, there was no way out. And at that moment he realized that his world was crumbling. He realized that he no longer controlled the situation. He realized that his power had vanished, but he still held the pistol. And then Crawford's hand slowly rose, not in a gesture of submission, not in fear. He simply straightened his finger and pointed at the pistol in Blaine's hands, and said quietly but clearly, "Do you know what happens now, Sergeant?" Blaine finally understood. He flinched, and then his fingers relaxed. The pistol fell to the ground. The dull metallic sound cut through the air, and with it, his career, his life was ruined. The pistol hit the ground with a short but deafening thud. This sound cut through the silence. Everyone, every officer, every soldier, every grieving family heard it, and they knew what it meant. Blaine stood motionless, his right hand still clutching the air, as if the weapon were there. But it was no longer there. This sound was a turning point, a dividing line between who he was before and who he had become now. He felt something slipping away from him. Power, control, his status. He took a deep breath, but his chest did not fill with air. He was suffocating. He knew it no longer mattered. And General Jonathan Crawford was not surprised. He did not move, did not speak. He just waited. He did not demand that Blaine drop the weapon. He did not threaten. But Blaine did it anyway. And now it was over. In the crowd, movement began. Officers exchanged glances. Some shook their heads in shock, unable to believe what had just happened. Others barely contained their anger. Some stood in silence, their arms folded behind their backs, but their gazes said it all. This man, this cop. He realized, but too late. He thought he was in charge here, but he was wrong. He just now realized this, and this was destroying him. Stanton slowly, almost imperceptibly, took a step back. He did not want to be near Blaine. He no longer wanted to be part of this, because this was a catastrophe. His breathing quickened. He remembered the moment when Blaine ordered him to shut up. He remembered the whistling of the wind. He remembered Crawford's gaze. This was not just a general. This was a man who had experienced something far greater than Blaine could imagine, and now he was completely humiliated. Stanton did not intend to share this fate. He did not intend to fall with him. General Crawford finally spoke. His voice was steady, cold, iron. "Take him away." These two words cut through the air. They were decisive. They were irreversible. Two military policemen who had been standing nearby moved forward. They did not rush. They walked confidently. Blaine heard the footsteps but could not move. He knew what was about to happen. He understood that this was the end, but he could not accept it. His face finally changed. In his eyes was everything: shock, anger, helplessness. But now he was no longer in control. He could no longer give orders. He was a man who had crossed the line, and now he would pay for it. Blaine tried to resist, but it was useless. When the policeman grabbed his arms, he struggled. "Wait!" But it was too late. They roughly twisted his arms behind his back, wrenching them so that he felt sharp pain in his shoulders. Metallic handcuffs clicked shut on his wrists. They cooled his skin. The sensation became real. "You can't do this!" He tried to break free. "This can't be happening." But it was happening, and everyone saw it. The crowd watched in silence. No one intervened. No one tried to help. The final moments of Blaine as a man of authority. They led him away. He tried to slow his steps. He tried to find support. He looked back at Stanton. But Stanton looked at the ground. He had already chosen his side. Blaine looked at the crowd. But no one met his gaze. They had already written him off. He was no longer the one giving orders. He was the one being led away. And when he finally realized this, he surrendered. His shoulders slumped, his body relaxed, but it no longer mattered. Crawford watches Blaine's fall. General Crawford watched all of this in silence. He did not smile. He did not look satisfied. He simply observed. Because this was not a victory. This was justice. And justice had been served. Chapter 7. The fall. Blaine was taken to the station. His trial begins. The patrol car screeched to a halt in front of the concrete police station building. The door creaked open, and Blaine was roughly pulled out. He staggered, but two military policemen did not let him fall. Their grip was firm, unyielding. They did not treat him as a colleague. He was a detainee, and this gnawed at him from within. Just an hour ago, he held a weapon in his hands, controlled the situation, and now he was being dragged like a criminal. Passing through the main entrance of the station, Blaine felt heavy gazes on him. Officers, his colleagues. Some averted their eyes. Others looked straight, expressionless. But no one expressed support. No one stood by his side. This was the hardest moment of his life. He was led through the corridor, past familiar faces, past people he had given orders to, past those who had feared him just yesterday. Now they were no longer afraid, because he was broken. Interrogation room, metal chair. Blaine sat down heavily like a sack of sand. His hands in handcuffs were placed on the table, the cold metal burning his wrists. In the room was only one person, Police Captain Gary Hendricks, bald with graying temples, with the tired gaze of a man who had seen too much. He sat down opposite, folded his hands on the table. For a few seconds there was silence. Hendricks just looked, and then said, "You screwed up, Roy." Blaine finally realized that he was now a victim of the system he had believed in. But the news spread quickly. Within 2 hours of the incident, the first reports appeared on screens. Television screens were filled with experts. "This is a disgrace," said one. "General Crawford is a respected man." What was this cop thinking? "We are seeing systemic racism again," stated an activist. "The question is, how many more such cases remain behind the scenes?" But there were also those who defended Blaine. "We don't know the whole story. Maybe he was just following instructions." Police officers risk their lives every day. Maybe he had reasons to act that way. The divide was obvious. But one thing was unchanged. Blaine was at the center of the storm. The military's reaction was swift and harsh. The Ministry of Defense issued a statement 3 hours after the incident. Speaking was Major General Richard Oldman. He stood before the cameras, his voice cold as ice. "General Crawford is a man who has dedicated his life to defending this country. What happened is unacceptable. In the Army, there was no doubt. Blaine had made a huge mistake. But the police, within the police ranks, a rift began. Some defended Blaine. He was just doing his job. It all got out of hand, but he's not a criminal. But others, even within the police department, demanded his punishment. This goes beyond all bounds. He has disgraced us all. A policeman who cannot distinguish a criminal from a hero should not wear a badge." Quiet office in the Pentagon. General Jonathan Crawford sat opposite the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Thomas Gray. Gray, a man in his 50s, rubbed his temples. His eyes filled with tension. "I am not surprised that this happened," Crawford finally said. "This is not the first time, and it won't be the last." Gray nodded, sighing. "We will pressure the police department. Blaine must be punished." Crawford looked intently at him. "Do you think that will change anything?" Gray hesitated. "It's, a precedent." Crawford shook his head with a humorless smile. "A precedent?" he said. "That was a precedent decades ago, but nothing has changed." "What do you suggest?" The general leaned forward, interlocking his fingers. "The system cannot be fixed by punishing individuals. We need to change the approach itself." Gray looked at him intently. "And what do you want to do?" Crawford slowly exhaled. Time will tell. Blaine sat on the defendant's bench. His hands were clasped together, his shoulders tense, his eyes cold. But inside he was shattered. In the courtroom, silence reigned. Before him were the federal judge, military prosecutors, police and army representatives. He was charged with several counts: abuse of power, use of a firearm without justification, creating a threat to the life of high military command. He faced 20 years in prison, but the real sentence had already been passed by society. Connections severed, career unsalvageable, life ruined. The first witness was Officer Oliver Stanton. He entered the courtroom with his gaze lowered. The prosecutor rose. "Officer Stanton, tell us what happened that day." Stanton glanced at Blaine. In his eyes, there was no pity, only cold acceptance of the inevitable. Sergeant Blaine gave the order to draw weapons without cause. He pointed his pistol at General Crawford. Each word struck like a hammer. Blaine clenched his fist, but he could not say anything. He had already lost. Then Colonel Catherine Bailey was called to testify. She was precise, stern, unyielding. Sergeant Blaine committed an act of direct insubordination to military command. He threatened the highest general of our army. His actions are unacceptable. And that was enough. After the hearing, Stanton stood in the corridor. Captain of Police Gary Hendricks approached him. "You understand that you won't be welcome in the department anymore?" he said softly. Stanton straightened his collar. "I did what was right," Hendricks nodded. "But that doesn't mean they'll forgive you for it." Stanton understood. He would face problems in the department, but he accepted it, because he did not intend to fall in Blaine's footsteps. General Crawford sat in his office looking out the window. Before him lay reports, hundreds of similar cases, but only this one made the headlines. Only this one caused a resonance. And how many more remain unnoticed? A knock at the door. Colonel Catherine Bailey entered. She silently placed another file in front of him. Crawford glanced. He clenched his jaw. Again. The system has not changed. Only one person fell, but the system remained. "What are we going to do?" Bailey asked. Crawford looked up at her. "Keep working, because this battle is not over yet." The judge raised the gavel. In the courtroom, there was a deadly silence. Blaine sat with a stony face, but inside he was gasping for breath. Sergeant Roy Blaine, a moment before the abyss. Guilty, and his world collapsed. 20 years, without the possibility of parole. He stared straight ahead but saw nothing. He had not yet realized what had happened. But when the guard clicked the handcuffs, only then did reality hit him like a hammer in the chest. He would not return. Never. 3 days later, the news had already moved on to another story. The incident with Blaine gradually faded into the background. But Crawford did not forget. He knew this incident was not the last. And the next Blaine was already out there somewhere. He sighed. On the table lay another case, and he opened it, because his work was not yet done. If there's anything else you need, or if you have any further questions, feel free to ask.